Does the rest of the world think that the US is a bad country? No way, now put the gun down. They are shocked at the cost of healthcare in the USA. As a Latin American, I guess it's fair to say most of us down south aren't fond of the USA at all after so many decades of political intervention, including multiple US-backed coups that resulted in death and social uncertainty. Your garden variety American tourist doesn't paint a good picture of the country as a whole. Not to mention the crap in the news. Dumb politicians, shootings, racism, shootings, overly entitled drama, and shootings. We don't think it's nearly as wonderful as Americans think it is. There's no such thing as a bad country, but there are the bad governments. I don't think the US is a bad country, but the US has way too much influence over other countries. It's kinda scary if you think about if one day all US-based companies decide to exit your country. Even all the social media giants are US-based, and I don't think there is any major alternative. As a resident of a small country, the USA scares us. The population is very politically informed and leading the world in progressive ideas and positive change, like gay rights and racial equality. That's a good thing, but it very easily leads to extremism. It looks like a very politically charged battleground for ideas. A place where people hold strong beliefs, disagree over many things, and are very eager to fight for their ideals. Every few weeks we get news like, the Americans are rioting again. This time over. It makes the people seem like dangerous and unstable fanatics. We know full well the USA is strong economically, technologically, and with nukes and the world's largest armies. If you wanted to, you could wipe any of us out easily. In recent decades, leaders like Trump also play up the jingoism, threatening sanctions and military force against the USA's enemies constantly. The idea that they can start a massive nuclear war any day and our tiny country is helpless to stop them is terrifying. If countries were people, the US is like the guy with anger issues and a gun in his pocket in a room with the rest of us. No matter how friendly and reasonable he sounds, deep down everyone is uncomfortable knowing what he might do if he snaps one day. Or you make an enemy of him. I'm actually in the middle. I get it that as a country it's very liberal for its citizens, but on the other hand it's very quick to judge other countries and tries to almost bully them into taking decisions that suits America. America in lots of the world is not viewed as a bastion of good. But bad country is hard to quantify. America has a reputation for being greedy and being okay with corporate interests killing for profit. So that's bad. But I would say there can be a difference in how people from America are viewed and how America is viewed. Definitely not the best country in the world. America is the world's drunk uncle. Sadly, he is heavily armed and considers himself a king. In the middle. Is it the best country in the world? Hell no lol. But it's also annoying when people say America is a third world country. Yeah, it isn't the best, but the situation is not comparable to the lives of people in countries like Guatemala or even Eastern Europe. From Sudan or North Korea being a 1 and Norway a 10. I'd say the US is like a 7. Here in Canada it's a common saying, at least we don't live in the USA. Depends what you mean by country. The US Gov. Armed forces and intelligence services are evil. I say that without hyperbole. They are evil. Doesn't matter which government is in power. Murdering thousands upon thousands of innocent people abroad is bipartisan US policy. Pretty much every single US president would be convicted of war crimes if brought up before The Hague. I include your beloved Obama and, yes, even possibly Jimmy Carter. Guatemala. It may be hard for people inside the US to see just what their armed forces are doing and have done. From what I can gather, the US press is not particularly free, despite mentioning freedom every 5 minutes. The sheer scale of US war crimes is extremely hard to comprehend. To see people in the US being struck down by Russian atrocities makes me think, do you know nothing about what your armed forces have done in the last few years alone? Quote. The US press use phrases like collateral damage and precision bombing campaign to hide the true reality of what the US armed forces do in the world. They define enemy combatants as any male aged 14 or over. They refrain from showing the true extent of US involvement in many global conflicts and censor the real facts of what's happening on the ground. US viewers are currently horrified by the images coming out of Ukraine. The similar images from Iraq etc. will never be shown there. And what's the motivation? Keeping the US economy going. There are more complicated nuances and explanations, but ultimately it all comes down to keeping the US economy strong. At least for the rich. That's before we even start with regimes supported by the US like Saudi Arabia with their Yemen genocide and Israel with their apartheid system and mowing the grass policy towards Gaza. With the coups they've staged of democratically elected governments in South America, Africa and Iran, with invariably disastrous consequences. Like I said, evil. If you mean the country itself, it has amazing parks, geography, pop culture, good people albeit a poorly educated populace, but that probably scales to most places. Despite the celebrated willful ignorance which seems to pervade their politics and much of the culture, they're responsible for a staggering amount of technological and scientific advances. I have more in common with a working American than I do with the people in charge of my country, Spain. I definitely feel more of a kinship with a guy working in an Amazon warehouse in Alabama than to some banking executive in La Zona Alta of Barcelona, regardless of their politics. Still though, I wish the American people would hold their government to account for the atrocities committed in their name. US Gov uses access as a form of censorship. Access is more important than reporting the horrors inflicted by the US on the world. So the US population are kept in the dark. As an anecdote to my disdain for the US press as a propaganda arm for the US war machine, Woodward, SP, and Bernstein are still venerated as the greatest journalists. It took Bernstein only a few minutes with Kissinger for the latter to cheerfully recount war crimes. The rest of the press either simply didn't ask or didn't report it. No, just annoyed when you guys poke into another country's business. Yes. And yes and no. I always have to comment how ironic it is for USA to think so highly of itself. All the patriotism and "we are the land of the free," which is just not true. And a big chunk of my social circle and a lot of people I've met and discussed it with agree. Scandinavia. I have American relatives in the States. And just a very few of them have agreed with some things, but I haven't discussed it too heavily. And some I know wouldn't agree, they're too blindly patriotic. Fed up political system. Having only two options in the end is so weird. Weapons and all the shootings. The racism that shows on so many levels. Although that OFC isn't USA only. Healthcare system. How deeply rooted religion is and on how many levels it affects political decisions. Exploiting of other countries. OFC also not USA only. Bombings of civilians in other countries, all the wars. The heavy use of military and making sure so many people join it because, for example, financially, they can't afford an education and have no choice. The continued treatment of the indigenous population. Again, not USA only, but still. People having to work like slaves. So much anti-union. Having to pay for college plus university, and therefore a lot of PPL not going. There's too much capitalism. Also, how much cars are used. And people hardly walk or bike? And the food plus portions. It's crazy. Those are smaller things in comparison, though. I can't say everyone would agree. Just as a statistical calculation. And I can't speak for other countries. But yeah. Edit. I also want to add pregnancy, maternity leave, things concerning having a baby as a woman. Especially after watching Superstore. Not that I didn't already know how FEF up everything in the States is regarding that. But DAAAMN. I don't want a baby, but I certainly extra much don't want to birth a baby in the US. Yeah. The ethnocentric attitude and crazy people shooting people every day doesn't exactly make the USA look so great. People do and people don't. That's about it. I don't know that I'd say bad per se, but could be so much better. I see some areas rolling back rights to reproductive and bodily autonomy. Rolling back the human rights of transgender people. The chronic racism and gun violence. Lack of access to healthcare for large numbers of the population and dog's breakfast of a political system, and I just hope that we don't drink that nut juice here in Australia. Personally, I'd say that the average American person is probably alright. Intensely dislike your right-wing conservatives. But then again, I'm not keen on ours either. You've got a whole heap of resources and amazing potential, but it's just being squandered on corporate greed and personal avarice.
If you enjoyed this video, please check out our playlists full of similar content. Epicaricast is like doom scrolling for your ears. Please like, share, and subscribe.